Annie actually answered Venom. OMG, you caught me. Anything Clark related from me is tainting her.
The sports media machine just wrote a hit piece on Caitlin Clark, and they got absolutely destroyed for it. That is where we are starting today. Because what happened in the last 48 hours is not just another Twitter spat, not just another bad faith column disappearing into the algorithm. This is a documented, undeniable, glaring example of how the establishment press operates when a player becomes too big, too powerful, and too impossible to ignore. The villain in this story is not hard to find. Brian Hamilton wrote the piece, Annie Constable boosted it, and the internet handed both of them exactly what they deserved. Welcome back, this is Rimrun, and today we are ripping the doors off the coordinated media campaign against Caitlin Clark. Naming every name, reading every line, and explaining exactly why this moment matters far beyond one technical foul and one bad faith column.
Clark sketched out her vision of what is acceptable in the modern WNBA. An official issued a call. She raised her hand like Neo stopping bullets in the Matrix.
Let me tell you what is actually at stake here, because if you think this is just about a single article, you are missing the entire picture. Caitlin Clark is the most important player in the WNBA right now, full stop. Not most important young player, not most important guard, most important player, period. The ratings prove it, the attendance figures prove it, the promotional machinery of the league itself proves it, even when that machinery tries to hide her. And that last part, that is where it gets brutal. Because even the Indiana Fever's own game promotions have been running other players' faces in the featured spots while Clark is suiting up and filling those arenas. Think about that for 1 second. The league's own promotional infrastructure is actively working around the player who is single-handedly keeping casual fans tuned in. That is not an accident, that is a choice. And it is a catastrophic, soul-crushing, baffling choice that reveals everything about the institutional hostility Clark has been navigating every single day of her professional career. And into that environment, the sports media decided this was the right moment to publish a piece framing Caitlin Clark as a spoiled diva who abuses her power to bend the WNBA to her will. That is not a characterization I am inventing. That is the framing the article itself invites. We are going to go through it line by line, and we are going to expose every single bad faith assumption buried inside it.
Annie actually answered Venom. OMG, you caught me. Anything Clark related from me is tainting her.
The article in question is titled something along the lines of The Fascinating Case of Caitlin Clark versus the WNBA. Who controls the spirit of the sport? Written by Brian Hamilton, promoted loudly by Annie Constable. And the core argument, the actual thesis the piece is building toward, is this: that Caitlin Clark appealing a technical foul is somehow an act of power-hungry manipulation. That her raising her hand after a disputed call, drawing a line in the sand, and daring the league to step back from it, is evidence that she is bending the WNBA to her will in some dangerous, destabilizing way. I want every single person watching this video to sit with that framing for a moment. Really sit with it. Because what Brian Hamilton is describing, a star player using her leverage to push back against officiating decisions she believes are wrong, is not a scandal. It is not a crisis. It is not even unusual. It is what every powerful player in the history of professional basketball has done. It is what Michael Jordan did. It is what the entire architecture of the NBA's star player protection system was built around. David Stern looked at what the bad boy Pistons were doing to Jordan in the late 80s. Looked at the revenue potential of letting the most electrifying player in the world actually play basketball without being mugged on every possession, and made a ruthless, surgical, mathematically obvious business decision: get out of his way. Let him fly. The Jordan rules existed because the league understood that protecting its transcendent talent was protecting its own future. The WNBA is staring at the exact same decision right now, in real time, with Caitlin Clark. And instead of making the obvious call, a significant portion of the establishment press is writing articles suggesting that the player who is carrying the entire league's visibility is somehow the problem for expecting to be treated fairly by officials. That is the argument. That is what Brian Hamilton put his name on.
Clark sketched out her vision of what is acceptable in the modern WNBA. An official issued a call. She raised her hand like Neo stopping bullets in the Matrix.
Now here is where the Annie Constable dimension of this story becomes genuinely revealing. Because Annie Constable did not write this article. Let me be entirely clear about that. She did not write it, she boosted it, she amplified it to her audience, she put her platform behind it. And when a fan called her out directly, pointing out that anything she shares related to Caitlin Clark seems specifically designed to damage Clark's image, Annie Constable did not deny it. She did not push back, she did not say, "That's not fair, I cover the league objectively." She responded publicly, and her response was, and I am quoting the transcript of this exchange directly, "OMG, you caught me. Anything Clark related from me is tainting her image." She said that, publicly, in a reply that she typed out herself and posted for anyone to read. Now, she tried to frame that as sarcasm. She tried to pivot immediately to defending the article's actual argument about officiating. But the damage was done because the mask slipped for exactly one sentence, and that one sentence told you everything you needed to know about the editorial posture she brings to every single piece of Caitlin Clark coverage she touches. You do not joke about tainting someone's image if the accusation is completely off base. You do not reach for sarcasm as your first defense if your conscience is clear. You deny it, flatly, immediately. She did not do that. And the fans who were watching that exchange in real time noticed. They noticed, and they said so loudly, and Annie Constable found herself on the receiving end of exactly the kind of public accountability that the establishment press never expects and never knows how to handle. Don't take my word for it on what she actually admitted. Here is the exchange in her own words. She said it. Right there in a public reply, with her name attached. "OMG, you caught me. Anything Clark related from me is tainting her image." That is the admission. That is the evidence. You can frame it as sarcasm all you want after the fact, but the instinct that produced that sentence, the first unguarded reflexive response to being called out, tells you exactly where her head is when she decides what Clark-related content deserves her platform and her amplification. That is not a neutral journalist making editorially balanced decisions. That is someone who has already decided what story she wants to tell about Caitlin Clark and is curating her boosts accordingly. And that matters enormously because Annie Constable is not a fringe account. She has reach. She has credibility in the press ecosystem. When she puts her name behind an article, it signals to other journalists that this framing is acceptable, that this angle is worth pursuing, that this is the conversation the basketball media should be having. She is not just one person sharing one bad article. She is part of the infrastructure that decides which narratives about Caitlin Clark get oxygen and which ones get buried. And she just told you in her own words what her role in that infrastructure actually looks like. Let us go deeper into the Hamilton article itself, because the specific language Brian Hamilton chose is worth examining very carefully. He writes that Clark's body language and behavior have, quote, overwhelmed the discourse. He writes that she is not shy about articulating grievances or exhibiting displeasure on the floor. He describes a play where Clark tried to establish position against a defender. The defender bumped back, no foul was called in either direction, and Clark reacted visibly. And Hamilton's framing of that sequence is that Clark looked like she had been hit with a cannonball. His tone throughout is that Clark's emotional expressiveness on the court is itself the problem. That her willingness to show frustration, to appeal calls, to communicate with officials, is somehow excessive or destabilizing. I want you to think about every male star in the history of professional basketball who has ever argued with a referee. Every single one. Jordan, LeBron, Kobe, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook. Every single one of those players has had moments of visible frustration, public appeals, theatrical reactions to calls they disagreed with. Not one of them had a national sports columnist write an article suggesting that their emotional expressiveness was a threat to the spirit of the game. Not one. The framing Hamilton applies to Clark, that her personality is too big, too demanding, too unwilling to accept whatever the officials hand her, is a framing that has never in the history of this sport been applied with this level of sustained intensity to a male star. Never. And the fact that it is being applied to Clark right now while she is doing everything in her power to drag this league into a new era of relevance is not a coincidence. It is a deliberate choice and it deserves to be called exactly what it is. Hamilton also makes a comparison to Angel Reese in the article, noting that Reese also picked up her 5th technical foul of the season on the same night Clark was dealing with her disputed call, and that Reese's team was also appealing. He frames this as evidence that powerful players are trying to dictate the league. But think about the asymmetry in how he presents it. Reese's situation gets a couple of sentences, offered almost as a footnote. Clark's situation is the entire thesis of the piece. Clark is the one whose behavior has overwhelmed the discourse. Clark is the one who drew a line and dared the league to step back from it. The rhetorical weight is not distributed equally. It never is. Here is the part of this story that the establishment press absolutely will not touch. And I mean will not touch with a 10-foot pole. While Brian Hamilton is writing about Caitlin Clark's body language on the court, while Annie Constable is amplifying pieces designed to taint her image, there is a completely separate, completely documented, completely unaddressed story sitting right in front of every sports reporter who covers this league. Stephanie White, the head coach of the Indiana Fever, and the allegations that have been made by former Vanderbilt players about the culture she ran at that program. A former Vanderbilt player went on record calling Stephanie White's basketball program toxic. That is not a rumor. That is a named accusation from someone who was inside that program, and in the entire sports media ecosystem. The same ecosystem that found the bandwidth to write a multi-thousand-word think piece about Caitlin Clark's hand gestures toward referees. Not one reporter has walked into a press conference and asked Stephanie White directly, "Do you have a comment on the former player who called your program toxic? Would you like to respond?" Not one, not a single one. The silence is absolute, the silence is deliberate, and the contrast between the media's aggressive scrutiny of everything Caitlin Clark does on the court and its complete, total, ruthless indifference to documented allegations about her head coach's conduct tells you everything you need to know about what this press corps actually considers newsworthy and what it considers too inconvenient to pursue. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. If you are a reporter who has decided that Caitlin Clark is the story, then Stephanie White's background is a problem for your narrative. It introduces complexity. It raises questions about whether the dysfunction around the Fever is coming from the player or from the leadership structure above her. And those are questions the establishment press has collectively decided it does not want to ask. Let me be very specific about what we know from the transcript of the Hamilton article, because the language he uses at the end is the most revealing part of the entire piece. He writes about the technical foul appeal process, normally a routine, procedural, almost administrative function, and frames Clark's use of that process as something dramatically different. He says that what is usually a perfunctory inquiry process for appealing technical fouls is now something more. He says she drew a line and effectively dared the league to step back from it. And then, and this is the part that matters, he says, "Good for her, good for her." Brian Hamilton, after spending an entire column framing Caitlin Clark's assertiveness as a destabilizing force, after using language like bending the WNBA to her will, after treating her emotional expressiveness as a threat to competitive integrity, ends by saying good for her. He walks himself right up to the edge of the actual correct conclusion, that a transcendent player using her legitimate leverage to push back against bad officiating is exactly what the league needs. And then he retreats. He retreats back into the framing that this is somehow novel, somehow unsettling, somehow worth an entire analytical column about who controls the soul of the sport. That retreat is the tell, because a writer who genuinely believed good for her would have led with that conclusion. He would have built the piece around the argument that Clark is doing what every great player does, what the Jordan rules were literally designed to accommodate, what the league should be celebrating rather than treating as a threat. He did not do that. He buried the concession at the end after spending several hundred words building the diva narrative, because the diva narrative is what generates clicks and the "actually she's right" conclusion is what generates accountability. Now here is what he actually wrote about her appeal, in his own words from his own column. Listen to how this is framed. Clark sketched out her vision of what is acceptable in the modern WNBA. An official issued a call. She raised her hand like Neo stopping bullets in the Matrix. That is what he wrote. That is the language he chose. Neo stopping bullets in the Matrix. He is describing a player appealing a referee's call, a completely standard, completely legal, completely routine part of professional basketball. And the literary reference he reaches for is a science fiction film about a man who bends the laws of physics through sheer force of will. The hyperbole is not accidental. The hyperbole is the argument. By framing Clark's assertiveness in those terms, Hamilton is trying to make the reader feel like something unprecedented and vaguely threatening is happening, something that needs to be examined, something that needs to be contained. But here is what is actually happening. Caitlin Clark is playing basketball. She is competing at the highest level of her sport. She is drawing fouls, getting calls she disagrees with, appealing those calls through the established process, and expressing herself emotionally on the floor the way every great competitor in the history of this sport has done. And the sports media is writing matrix metaphors about it because they do not know how to cover a player this big without either worshipping her or tearing her down, and they have collectively chosen tearing her down as the more interesting editorial posture. I want to spend some time on the business dimension of this, because the business dimension is where the establishment's argument completely collapses, and there is no recovering from it. The WNBA is a business. Professional basketball is a business. The Indiana Fever are a business. And in any business, the first, second, and third priority is understanding who your customers are, what they came to see, and making absolutely certain that the product you are delivering matches what the paying public is actually demanding. Right now, the paying public is demanding Caitlin Clark. The ratings data supports this. The attendance data supports this. The promotional reach of the league itself, in its most honest moments, acknowledges this, even when the promotional machinery is simultaneously trying to feature other players in the marquee spots. People are tuning in because of Caitlin Clark. Some people have tuned out specifically as a form of protest against the front office decisions and the coaching decisions and the institutional treatment she has received. And the ratings are still substantial. Think about what that means. Even with a portion of the fan base actively boycotting in protest of how Clark has been handled, the numbers are holding. That is not a testimony to the league's management. That is a testimony to how absurdly powerful Caitlin Clark's individual draw is, and how much larger those numbers could be if the institutional machinery around her was working with her instead of against her. The NBA understood this calculus with Michael Jordan. David Stern looked at the revenue projections, looked at what Jordan was capable of doing for the league's global footprint, and made the ruthless, surgical, mathematically correct decision to protect the asset. The Jordan rules were not about fairness. They were not about competitive balance. They were about the NBA understanding that it had a once-in-a-generation talent, and that the appropriate response to a once-in-a-generation talent is to get out of the way and let them be great. That decision made the NBA into what it is today. That decision funded 30 years of global expansion, television deals, merchandise revenue, and cultural dominance. The WNBA has that same decision in front of it right now, and the establishment press is writing articles about whether Caitlin Clark is too powerful. Let me tell you what the coordinated nature of this looks like from the outside, because I think it is important to name it clearly. You have a head coach, Stephanie White, who has documented allegations from former players about her program's culture. You have a front office that has made decisions that have frustrated Clark and her supporters throughout this season. You have a league office that has allowed officiating inconsistencies to continue without meaningful accountability. And you have a press corps that, instead of investigating any of those institutional failures, has decided that the most newsworthy angle on Caitlin Clark's 2025 season is whether her personality is too assertive. That is a coordinated editorial choice. It may not be a conscious conspiracy. I am not suggesting that Brian Hamilton and Annie Constable are sitting in a room together plotting against Caitlin Clark. What I am suggesting is something more insidious and more structural than that. I am suggesting that the sports media has a set of comfortable narratives about women's basketball, about what a female star is supposed to look like and sound like and behave like, and that Caitlin Clark's refusal to conform to those narratives creates genuine discomfort in the press ecosystem. And when the press ecosystem is uncomfortable, it does not examine its own discomfort. It writes articles about why the player making it uncomfortable is the problem. That is what Brian Hamilton's piece is. That is what Annie Constable's amplification of it represents. Not malice in the individual necessarily, but something more systemic and more difficult to root out. A collective editorial reflex that treats a powerful, assertive, emotionally expressive female athlete as a problem to be managed, rather than a phenomenon to be celebrated. And here is the other thing that needs to be said directly, because it connects back to the Annie Constable admission we heard earlier. The sports media's relationship with independent commentary about the WNBA has become genuinely adversarial. The establishment press has noticed that independent voices, commentary channels, fan accounts, people who actually watch the games and react to them without institutional filters, are generating enormous engagement around Caitlin Clark. And instead of asking why that is, instead of examining what it says about the gap between what the establishment press is producing and what the audience actually wants, the establishment press has decided that the independent voices are the problem, that the engagement those voices generate is somehow manufactured or manipulative. Hamilton's article takes a shot at this dynamic directly, framing independent commentary as a kind of influence operation, suggesting that the passionate fan response to Clark's situation is being manufactured rather than earned. He uses the word influencers in a way that is clearly meant to be dismissive. to suggest that the people who are most vocally supportive of Clark are not genuine fans making genuine observations, but rather content machines generating artificial outrage. But here is the question that framing cannot answer. Why are those voices generating the engagement they are generating? If the establishment press were doing its job, if it were asking the questions that needed to be asked, covering the stories that deserve to be covered, holding the right people accountable, then independent commentary would have no oxygen. The audience would not be hungry for alternative perspectives because the mainstream perspective would be satisfying the demand. The fact that independent commentary about Caitlin Clark is thriving is not evidence that those voices are manipulating the audience. It is evidence that the establishment press has abdicated its responsibility to that audience, and the audience has gone looking elsewhere for the truth. Let me make some very specific predictions about where this goes from here, because I think the trajectory of this story is actually more important than the individual incident that sparked it. First, the technical foul appeal. Caitlin Clark drew a line. She appealed the call through the proper channels. She made it unmistakably clear that she was not going to absorb bad officiating in silence. The league now has to decide whether to uphold the call or overturn it. And that decision is not just about one technical foul. It is about whether the WNBA is going to follow the same basic business logic that David Stern applied to Michael Jordan 3 decades ago. If they uphold it, if they dig in and refuse to acknowledge that the call was questionable, they are choosing institutional pride over institutional survival. If they overturn it, they are acknowledging implicitly what every honest observer already knows, that Clark has been on the receiving end of officiating decisions that would not survive scrutiny if they were applied to any other player in the league with her level of visibility and commercial importance. Second, the Brian Hamilton article is not the last one. It is not even the worst one. The establishment press has now tested this framing, the spoiled diva who bends the league to her will, and even though it got destroyed on social media, even though Annie Constable's public admission of her own bias became the story, the underlying editorial appetite for that framing has not gone away. It will come back. It will come back the next time Clark appeals a call, the next time she shows frustration on the court, the next time she does anything that can be framed as assertive or demanding. And when it comes back, the language will be slightly more careful, the framing will be slightly more subtle, and the goal will be exactly the same: to make the audience feel like Caitlin Clark's power is a problem rather than a gift. Third, the Stephanie White question is not going away. The allegations from former Vanderbilt players about the culture she ran at that program are documented. They are on record. And at some point, whether it is a mainstream reporter who finally decides the story is worth pursuing, or an independent voice who does the digging that the establishment press refuses to do, those allegations are going to receive the scrutiny they deserve. And when that happens, the contrast between the media's relentless focus on Clark's on-court behavior and its total silence on her head coach's documented off-court conduct is going to look even more damning than it already does. I want to close on Caitlin Clark herself, because I think it is easy in a conversation like this to get so deep into the media criticism and the institutional analysis that you lose sight of the actual human being at the center of all of it. So let me be direct about what Caitlin Clark is doing, right now, in the present tense, in the middle of all of this noise. She is playing basketball. She is showing up every single night and competing at a level that is filling arenas and driving ratings and giving the WNBA the kind of visibility it has been trying to manufacture for decades. She is absorbing officiating decisions that reporting suggests have not always been consistent or fair. She is navigating a front office environment that has not always aligned with her interests. She is playing under a head coach whose background contains documented allegations that the press refuses to examine. And she is doing all of this while the establishment media writes articles about whether her personality is too big for the room. And she is not backing down. That is the part that the Brian Hamiltons of the world cannot seem to process. She raised her hand, she appealed the call, she drew the line and dared the league to tell her to step back from it. Not because she is a diva, not because she is trying to bend the league to her will for the sake of bending it, but because she understands, clearly, surgically, with the competitive intelligence of someone who has been winning at every level of this sport her entire life, that the moment she stops pushing back is the moment the institutional machinery around her feels licensed to push harder. She is not going to give them that moment. She is going to keep competing, keep appealing, keep expressing herself on the floor with the full force of her personality. And the league is going to have to decide whether it wants to be the entity that tried to contain her or the entity that finally got out of her way and let her be great. The establishment press has made its choice. Brian Hamilton made his, Annie Constable made hers, and then accidentally told you exactly what that choice looks like from the inside. Caitlin Clark is still out there, every single night, making the choice that matters. And the fans who are watching, the fans who drove the engagement that made Annie Constable's admission the story instead of the article she was promoting, they have made their choice too. Here is the question I want you to answer in the comments right now, and I want a real answer, not a vague one. When the WNBA looks at what Caitlin Clark represents for this league, the ratings, the attendance, the cultural reach, the commercial potential, and then looks at the institutional resistance she has faced from coaches, front offices, officials, and the press, do you believe the league is going to make the David Stern move and get out of her way? Or do you believe the old guard is going to keep grinding against her until the audience finally loses patience entirely? That is the forced choice. That is what this moment is actually about. Drop your answer below. If this video gave you something the establishment press refused to, hit the subscribe button right now and make sure the notification bell is on. We are going to keep pulling on every thread they want left alone. This is Rimrun. We will see you on the next one.